some of your comments at this point. What is one thing that you've learned so far that you think is important? Someone, some brave soul, will go first.
That I wished I had done this a long time ago. So I had all of these years, so I didn't become highly skilled in the wrong way.
Right.
You know.
So
if I'd taken all that energy that you've done to accumulate where you are today and done it correctly in the correct thinking process, how much wiser we'd all be and where we would be today.
Yeah, that's a very powerful idea, and it's relevant to all of our work this week, because I think one of the things that keeps people from developing as thinkers is that they have a lot invested in what they've already done. So it's something like this. You're telling me that I've been teaching for 20 years and I've been doing it in this very poor way? That's about my identity. And it's hard to let that go. So I really appreciate sort of piggybacking. It's not the same point, but to a related point. Good. Others?
I like when you made the point that egocentric thinking is unconscious, and when it sees the light of day, the impulse is to engage in self-deception. I mean, there's another alternative, right? Some people say, oh, you're right, I did make a mistake. I mean, which is what we hope.
Right. But there's another good point. How often in life do you hear people saying, I was wrong? How often do you say that? So insofar as we're operating from our ego, let's say in the term of egocentricity, not Freud's ego. So if I use that word ego, I mean egocentricity. Insofar as we're doing that, we're not going to admit that we're wrong, unless we're manipulating someone. So I might say, well, you know, I was really wrong when I said so-and-so, when really I don't think I'm wrong, I'm just trying to get you to think I am saying this for some reason. So that's an important point, yes.
When you were talking about being egocentric and you were talking about the rigid mind, and like pictures of people were going through my head who see, but even that in itself is egocentric, because instead of thinking of myself, I was automatically thinking of other rigid thinkers. So.
Good point. And you know, it's interesting because I think especially when you first start sort of working with this concept, this is the natural phenomenon. And it's good because you need to have examples. And I said, let's look for examples to just prove the point that egocentricity is a problem. And then the next phase will be, and you start to see it in yourself. And then I figured that'll happen about 20 years, for about 20 years, and then you'll start to actually get command of it. Right.
Yeah, well, I was just basically going to say what you just said.
Oh.
I'm an actor, and one of the things that we do in acting classes, whenever you present a scene or a monologue, you have peer critique. So everyone has to critique everyone else. And as I started doing that, I started seeing things in other people that I thought, oh, well, that's a problem. And then I would say, oh, but they think that that's working, and I do that too, and I think it works when I'm doing it. But now that I see it, I see that it doesn't work. So then I was able to change my own. But it's a little different because I don't know, acting is easier for me to change than my thinking. You know? So, but I think that if you start seeing other people as a sort of stepping stone, as long as you eventually go back to yourself.
I think that thinking is perhaps the hardest thing to change. And I think that this barrier to the development of thinking that we're talking about today is perhaps, well, let's just say one of the most important concepts that we can learn if we're going to develop as thinkers. I was going to say perhaps the most important, but I'll leave that to you, because it's not all we need to do is to figure out when we're being egocentric, but we can get a pretty good distance if we focus on this problem, and then of course bring the tools of critical thinking to bear upon it and to help us correct for these problems. Other thoughts? Yes.
The care you took to define what exactly was egocentric thinking, I think is essential. How many times do we have a discussion or an argument and find out that we're actually having 3 different arguments because we don't have a common understanding at the base of that's kind of tangential, but I think
No, it's a very good point. It's something I'm learning to do, and I'm really focusing on that, so I'm glad you're noticing that I did that. Yes?
And from where I sit, which is in government, self-deception is probably, every time there's been a failure, whether it's Pearl Harbor, Cuban Missile Crisis, or the response to Katrina, it's because we're self-delusional about some aspect of what turns out doesn't work. And it happens over. And that reminded me, and I'm not a practicing Christian of any flavor, Jesus once remarked that it's much easier to recognize the mote in somebody else's eye than the log in your own. And I think that what that speaks to me reminds me that, as you pointed out, this is perhaps a basic element of human nature and has been for 2,000 some years, and probably wasn't new in Roman Palestine either. So
Now, any other burning thoughts at this point? Yes?
It seems that the way we think about things also is colored by our values, our professional, personal values, and that may or may not, but I think could be a barrier.
Can you give us an example of that?
Well, let's take organ transplant for sake of example. Okay. If we look at criteria by which recipients are chosen for organ transplants, what is that criteria? Where is it coming from? And values and personal ethics come into that decision. When we have people around the table that have different values and different ethics around that decision, then conflict exists. And we see that in the media about who got what transplant, who was on what list, that sort of thing.
Right. So how is that connected to egocentricity?
Well, egocentricity to be I think my comment was not that it's related to egocentricity. I think what it's related to is how we think. That's
So
the point.
Okay. All right. Good. Now, did you notice what I did with Sandra? What was I doing with her?
How is it related?
I was asking her how is it related, so I was asking for relevance. What else?
Give an example.
Asking for example. Why did I ask her for example?
Clarity?
Clarity, looking for clarity. Good. So, I was focused on Sandra's thinking as a student in this room, who's thinking her way through the content. And I'm hoping that I'm modeling throughout these 6 days the kind of thinking that we need to do in the classroom with our students. So that at that moment, Sandra's thinking is more important to me than anything else. Obviously the other students' thinking as well, but helping her find the relevance, see where it is relevant or if it's not. And this is connected with intellectual humility and the ability to say, which didn't happen in this case, but at some point my students might say, well, I don't really see the relevance. This was relevant. But if my students say, oh yeah, well now that you mention it, it's not really relevant, or I'm not seeing the relevance right now, then I'm rewarding that, because that's what I want to hear them doing. So that's something that we want to be fostering in our own classes, helping students sort of work it out. And sometimes many times, we have to work it out as we're speaking it. Often we think we have it worked out and we start talking and then we realize, this is real mushy. And I need to figure this out. And this is common in human thinking.